Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Supply Chains in Crisis, Managing Suppliers During Disruption. I'm Emily Figg. I'm Vice President here at OnSpring, and with me today is Jason Rolfe, also Vice President. He runs the Solutions Engineering team here at the company, and then we also have a member from his Solutions Engineering team with us, Michael Blumrich. So please welcome everybody. And I just want to start by giving a little bit of context around the purpose of this webinar and how it got instigated. So we've been having conversations recently with leaders from the procurement and sourcing teams at companies across the world, and we've been talking about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and how it's impacted their relationship with vendors. All of us are sitting here watching the turmoil of this event, and it's upending so many businesses, and so many of us are just anxiously working to figure out how do we pivot from our current approach so that we can adjust for tomorrow and all of the days of the future. So we put this webinar together to share a few examples of how other organizations that are quite honestly similar to yourself, how they're shifting their approach to managing their supply chain and trying to figure out what they can do during this disruption. So we're going to give you some practical guidance and some advice for specific tactics that you all can implement in your own organization. So I will tell you that we are recording this webinar, so we'll send out a link to the recording afterwards. And if anyone has questions throughout the webinar, please post them in the Q&A section. We'll address all the questions at the end, and if we don't get to all of them, we can always follow up with you directly. So let's get started. So honestly, just last week, we hosted a discussion on a very similar topic with companies that were made up of the Global 2000 list. We hosted this discussion in conjunction with the Procurement Leaders Organization. Surfaced three common themes. One, how do we keep trust and support with our suppliers right now, but how do we also protect our businesses at the same time? And then lastly, what are the risks that we should be looking at now as a business that we were blind to before? So the summary of that conversation was all of us are kind of in this existential conundrum where we're trying to figure out how do we partner with our vendors in a means that we've never done before, and how do we do that to make sure that all of our businesses come out ahead at the end of this disruption. So in many regards, our businesses are contingent on one another. So this is the best time of any to revisit what partnerships with our vendors can really mean. The core elements of any business is completely focused on preserving cash flow, preserving continuity of supply, and maintaining a sales pipeline. But when you juxtapose those elements between your own business and that of your vendors, they often compete. It's you against them. So we need to figure out how can we make this work. So I'm going to ask Jason to start first and tell me, where do you think companies should be going from here?
Yeah, thanks, Emily. It's a great point, and really to answer. And good morning, everybody, and good afternoon. To answer that question, I think the best place to start for an organization is really to start diving in and exploring the attributes of your own supply chain. That's obviously going to be the place where all of the most critical information is going to lie to help you sort of figure out this conundrum and solve this puzzle that we're being presented with. So when you consider your own supplier universe, it's certainly possible that there could be hundreds, if not thousands, of different suppliers that you're dealing with. They can be in various parts of the globe, which, as we've seen in this particular situation, this global pandemic, it is truly global. It's impacting every corner of the earth. There are going to be different parts of your business that are impacted or are working with these different suppliers, sometimes very diverse parts of your business. And certainly the nature and the extent of the services or the goods that those suppliers or those vendors are providing you could be quite varied. So obviously a very large net to cast here in terms of getting to the bottom of this conundrum. So how do you start? Where do we start? Well, the first thing we want to do is figure out who we're going to help, pinpoint where help is needed. And really, it's going to come down to the criteria that's important to you and your organization. And we'll talk about that in just a second. The next kind of critical step, once we determine who's really critical, who can use our help in the immediate term, is how do we help? A key point here will be focusing on your own organization's goals, your own organization's operations, what's important to you. And certainly understanding who those strategic suppliers are going to actually help you in that regard. And then from that point, to accomplish these two pretty lofty goals of helping your suppliers and identifying who needs your help, we need to understand how we get there. And the answer to that is really rooted in a couple of things. It's rooted in data that you can use to help drive those decisions. And that's going to be balanced with your own organization's culture, your own organization's risk tolerance. Okay, so before we can analyze, before we can figure out and pinpoint and get to the root of this, we must collect the data. So what you see here in this slide is just kind of, where do we get our data from? What are the potential sources for data that can inform us about the relative importance or criticality of our supply chain and the suppliers that make that up? Well, as you can see here, there's really three primary methods. The first one is kind of those active monitoring tools. Think about third-party tools and data sets that you can leverage to assess a supplier's financial health, a supplier's overall viability. Maybe it's their information security posture. Being able to kind of use those streams of data to help classify or prioritize those different suppliers. There's certainly, and I'm sure most, if not all of the folks on the phone are dealing with data that is sort of in that traditional bucket, right? Those that have your own categorical importance, whether that's the amount of money you spent on them, the type of service they provide, how long they've been a supplier, just individual data sources that, maybe individually are relatively minor, but when taken as a collection can really start to tell a little bit of a broader story and help drive that importance. And something we're seeing a lot lately, which is really, Emily talked about the focus conversations we have. It's going directly to those suppliers. It's gathering data directly from them on a mass scale. And in order for that to be feasible, in order for that to be useful, it certainly needs to be efficient. It certainly needs to be scalable, and it needs to be consistent so that you're not spending all of your time simply trying to get this data. But if you think about it, your suppliers are going to be the direct source where you can get a lot of really good data to help drive these decisions. So some organizations may use all three of these methods. Some might use some combination or maybe more focused on one particular method versus another. But like we said, and I'm sure as Emily will point out, we've really been trending more towards this direct interaction with the supplier.
Yeah, I think that brings up a good point, Jason. So we did a poll with the 600 companies that we talked to last week from the Fortune 2000 list, and we asked them the same question. Like, of these three sources, active monitoring, categorical importance, and just direct, perhaps survey assessments to your suppliers, which ones are you guys using and how are they coming out? So the results of that poll, I want to show everybody just to get some context so you can see how you maybe compare with everybody else. Half of them are actually doing some sort of survey assessment to get firsthand information. 21 of them are just using traditional methods to sort who's most important to their business. 14% are using active monitoring streams. But I think the most telling part of the data that we got back from this poll is that 15% of those companies aren't using anything right now to collect information, which is a little bit terrifying if you are in the business of keeping a handle on the risk of your supply chain.
And, Emily, thank you for bringing up that point. That last metric, really highlights what a lot of organizations are often faced with, and that's capacity. The majority of organizations, they don't have necessarily the means to one, manage all of the different data collection elements, or all of the different areas where this data can come from. And then from there, they also may not even have the means to really process it and extract the core insights that will ultimately drive appropriate business decisions. What this comes down to, and how a lot of companies today have found a way to better manage this, is efficiency and aggregation wherever is possible. And really just being able to find a way to directly and easily connect, compare, and analyze data gathered on your supplier from any variety of these sources. I have something that I want to show you all today, and how a lot of organizations are successfully doing this, just from a systematic standpoint. So, you notice metrics from Security Scorecard. Those are those third-party, providers. And then you also have the ability to compare those directly with maybe your own internal ratings. That's only one stage of it. You also need the ability to dive directly into the supplier records and say, okay, this is a key supplier for us. Let's send out a direct-to-supplier assessment targeting any variety of areas: risk management, privacy, organizational security, allowing you to gather information directly from the source, whether it's yes, no questions, whether it's actually attached documents, but then being able to bring that, once again, systematically into the tool to perform that deeper level of analysis to see, okay, what areas of this supplier are we having potential issues with, or that could bring additional risk to our organization. And then taking it from that line level, that very granular level, back up to this broader view to start the process again. Once again, driving efficiency and in aggregation where at all possible.
Yeah, that's great, Michael. That's super helpful. And really, if we talk about gathering the data as sort of the foundation, once you get that information, and you can place any level of priority on that information, that's meaningful to you. And I think that's a key point too, that you as a vendor management or a procurement leader can determine what's done with this information regardless of what the source is. You have the ability to dissect this information, take the findings that you've gotten from all of this information and use it to drive you into the right direction. And this is another great point to just stress that concept of your organization, your needs being unique. Certainly there are going to be standards that apply across the board, but really when you think about your own organization's culture, your cash position, your overall business outlook, in the context in which you utilize and leverage those suppliers, all of these are going to be factors that are going to drive you towards who is that subset of suppliers we can help, or how can we collaborate or work with our suppliers to keep this relationship going where it's really needed. And what we're offering up here on this slide too is, I think the key word here is appropriate. It's not to imply that these are the only ways that you can help. It's certainly not to imply that everyone should be doing these things. These are really examples for consideration. But just we wanted to provide a couple of kind of tangible examples of ways you can work directly with those suppliers that you have deemed to be critical to your operations, and really start to make sure that you can be an active participant in allowing them to continue those services. So just for example, on the financial support side, maybe making early payments. If your organization is in a better cash position, and making early payments might help that supplier with their own supply chain or with their own operations. Or if you can delay any extensions in payment terms, just as another example. Hey, we know we were going to kick it from 30 to 60 days, but maybe we'll keep paying you within 30 days just to keep that capital flowing between your organizations. Maybe from more of an operational standpoint, instead of just flat out canceling or terminating, things can go into a holding pattern. If they can't give you full quantity delivery or full on-time delivery, maybe those requirements can be relaxed a little bit, so that the whole concept of some is better than none. If you put on the hat of someone in financial services and they hold mortgages to people's houses, this is something we've heard a lot in the news. The bank would rather work with you to make sure that you can get back very soon to being a regular payer of your mortgage than they would to just kind of seize that property away from you. I think that same concept applies here. Also, just avoiding canceling in process orders. Maybe your situation is such that you can't commit to doing anything in the immediate term, but also, maybe delaying instead of canceling is another way to at least give some assurance to that set of suppliers. So really, if you think about it, again, these are just a few examples, and meaningfully applied, they can be really powerful things that you can do to really strengthen that bond with your supply chain.
Yeah, so Jason, I'll jump in here. We talked with the companies from last week's conversation about what they were specifically doing. What were they enacting for suppliers to give a little bit of, I don't want to call it life support, but definitely some support for their businesses. And we put together a poll, and what we saw come back was that 35% of all of these companies were actually offering early invoice payments to their suppliers, which to me is honestly positively surprising, because for the last couple of years, we've actually seen a reversal in payments being made, and instead of being on time, they actually end up becoming late. So the fact that these are coming early is a really, really good sign. 28% saw no order cancellations. They weren't planning on canceling anything. Everything stays the same. 17% of them who had contract renewals coming up in the next 3 months were continuing to renew. And then 20% felt like their business was stable enough and their supply chains were okay that they didn't have to do anything. I think that's overall, I think these are positive signs and perhaps signal that the state of a lot of our businesses might be in a better cash position than we have seen in previous downturns, specifically the 2008 downturn. So a little bit of positivity amidst all of this despair right now.
And I love, following positivity with, I wouldn't call it necessarily realism, but just the fact that, those resources, even though, Emily is spot on with that in terms of, these numbers that came out of our webinar last week, those resources are finite. And at some point, the belt is going to tighten. And how those resources are allocated and appropriated are going to, become under greater scrutiny. And what's really key is having information at your fingertips to say, this is the critical suppliers to our organization, and if they fail, then our business model or organization as a whole, it could potentially falter. But the big thing is, how do we gain access to that information? How do we really have it all in one place? And what does that information mean to be able to make those kinds of decisions? A way that we're able to do that, and how organizations are managing this, just from a systematic standpoint, is once again the aggregation of information. So if we look at things purely by the numbers, suppliers by spend, or POs, purchase orders awaiting shipments, you can very quickly see, especially if those POs awaiting shipments, that there's an anomaly. And if you're purely looking at the numbers, you might say, oh wow, it could be really beneficial for our organization to save a few $100,000 if we find a way to pause this, or maybe split this payment up into a variety of different smaller payments, things of that nature. But what happens when you actually dive deeper into what that particular supplier is doing to your organization or doing for your organization? Is it involved in any sort of critical processes or objectives? And in this case, we can easily dive into the supplier itself and see they are actually helping with the management of the work from home, network and VPN traffic risk, as well as the tech that they're providing is going to help in the event we have a large-scale network outage or system backup deployment. Ultimately, we can't always rely on that surface level information, and it's about the aggregation of different sources, different types of that info, and being able to easily relate it to your company and your organization as a whole.
Yeah, it's a great point, Michael, and I think this is an excellent start. I mean, Michael just gave one small example of how just key interrelationships of data, even just being able to see those and being able to look at a particular supplier or a vendor and just understand what those relationships are, but understand that once those relationships are made, there's a lot of power in being able to report and aggregate and so forth. And that kind of leads us to, what those expectations are going to look like, right? And what Michael kind of laid out is really just the start, or just a good example of kind of the broader set of responsibilities and expectations that are going to exist for the folks, on the procurement or the vendor management side. So, the questions that are now coming up today are going to start coming more fast and more furious and become more prevalent as we, head into this new future that we have. So, where are we with these contracts? What are the impacts of this particular, this vendor on our financial projections or on our ability to meet key operational goals? What are we missing? What are the risks that we see, or what's the frequency and the urgency of these risks that we're seeing emerge? And all of these are going to become kind of these existential questions that are going to require quick and swift response. So if we think about these future expectations, what do we kind of see in our little crystal ball here? Well, I think we've all kind of figured out that tomorrow is definitely going to be more complex. Given that we're only going to be kind of seeing the complexity grow and extrapolate out, the sooner you can get the basic foundations in place, the basic structures and the data relationships and those data points that are really meaningful for you, that sets up a nice infrastructure so that you can consume that information and have systems and processes in place to be able to adequately react to that. And that's going to become really critical when we think about number 2 on the screen, which is an increased expectation and increased need for, information at your fingertips. Those questions that I just kind of lobbed at the beginning of this slide, having the answers to those on demand, or at the very least being able to very efficiently get to those answers without having to spend a lot of unnecessary time that could be quite detrimental trying to track all of that information down. In accordance with that, just because we understand that this is going to be a complex future and we set our course on a particular direction, what we clearly have seen is that things can change on a dime. Things can change very quickly. Expectations and priorities will shift. So having that agility and flexibility built into your program, built into your process, just built into your general mindset is going to be of utmost importance. We can't just operate assuming that everything is going to keep going as it has. We need to be nimble. We need to be able to shift perspectives, shift expectations pretty quickly. And what that all ultimately leads us to is this kind of concept of widespread transparency. I think Michael did a great job of highlighting just those basic examples of how having all of the different pieces of information collected together, about a particular supplier or about a particular vendor kind of informs not just the vendor management group, the supplier group, but also informs everyone on the other end of those relationships of how they're impacted and where and when they should really be involved.
And along the lines of not only transparency, but all of these components that Jason just spoke about in regards to these future expectations, visibility is key. Having the ability to easily view data and derive process in both a bottom-up as well as top-down approach. And what I've shown you so far, pertaining to how companies are managing some of these different hardships or issues that they're running into from a supplier management standpoint, it really comes down to what is being input, and it's kind of line level what I've talked through so far. Being able to tie a supplier to company initiatives, being able to have those particular metrics from whether it's third-party monitoring services, direct-to-supplier assessments, your own kind of internal categorization or ratings. But what this really culminates in is, what is the work you've been doing to gather this information, analyze this information? What does that look like from the top down, from the kind of the management side of things? And what's really nice about how organizations are doing this from a systematic standpoint, especially when you're able to aggregate all of that information into a single system, is through reporting and just the ability to roll that up. And I think we have one more video to show of how organizations are able to roll this up to that management level. So you can see here, top 5 suppliers by spend. The metric of suppliers with POs awaiting shipment. Once again, that's just kind of your core, management 30,000-foot view. Okay, where is the big money going? Are there particular suppliers that we have more kind of outstanding purchase order awaiting shipment type scenarios, and being able to easily categorize that, but also taking it down another level, looking at this from suppliers that are actively tied to the reduction of organization level risk, and also suppliers that are directly tied to some component of business continuity planning, and being able to relate all of that to, do any of these suppliers have open findings? And if so, what are the criticality of those findings? Having all of that, at your fingertips in a single source, really starts to allow for those educated and very objective decisions to be made about who truly are the most critical suppliers to our organization. Are those suppliers at risk due to the current crisis that we're in with COVID-19? And if so, how can we allocate necessary resources to them to help not only the supplier, but also our organization as a whole during this time? Once again, having all of that information in a single place and being able to make that just kind of one screen comparison helps really make that process more efficient as well as more effective in those hard decisions.
Cool. Thanks, Michael. So let's take it in a little bit different direction and talk a little bit about what you can start doing today if you have not already. And the first is an effort to building trust and collaboration between your organization and your vendors when they might be under a diminished cash flow position. So the most important thing is to just keep communication lines open. Practice transparent information sharing. This is what impacts your business. This is where you communicate what you need from them, and vice versa, what they need from you. So there's a couple different ways that you can go about doing it. The way that I recommend doing it is planning a couple different touch points in different formats. So they could be phone calls, they could be emails, but first you should think about sending either a weekly or maybe a bi-weekly email to suppliers that updates them on your business. So include updates that are specific to any operational changes in your business that could impact your vendors. Let them know what's changed and how they may be affected. Also include updates about your own customer changes that impact your business. That will trickle down and give them some visibility into what they can expect from future orders, how they might need to shift or adjust. And lastly, in those communications, make sure you tell your suppliers how they can help you. What do you need from them? How are you thinking about things? Give them something that they can react to with a yes or a no, or hey, I haven't thought about that. Let me think about it and get back to you. So those are things that you should be doing to proactively communicate transparency to your suppliers. Secondly, you should also thinking about calling your suppliers. And this is where you put that emotional, the human touch element into it. And that becomes questions about how are they doing? How are they doing as people? How is their business doing? What are they experiencing with their employees? Are their employees doing okay? Are they back at work? Are they in their homes? How is that impacting their production lines? Ask them questions about what they might be projecting for distribution, if they see any hiccups in logistics, getting products out the door, what timetables look like for those things. And lastly, maybe perhaps the most important element is ask them how you can help. What can I do to help your business? Because this is a mutually beneficial relationship. We need you to succeed. You need us to succeed. So ask those questions, put yourself out there to give them some things to react to, and you should expect the same back from them. So the other thing that you definitely need to start taking a look at, if you have not done now, is putting together some type of vendor risk mitigation plan. These types of plans should be broad enough that it gives overall coverage across every single one of your supplier tiers, but it still gives you what I would call like a drill down visibility into any tiers or any groups of suppliers that might pose high risk. So the purpose of this exercise is to identify what could negatively impact your most important business units, your most important systems, your most important products. This is what essentially paints the landscape and tells you where to focus and where to prioritize. So there's a couple ways to do this. First thing is just outline any business assets you need to protect. Your organization might already have this. If you partner with someone from your risk management team, your continuity and recovery team, this probably already exists. And then you need to look at what information do you need to collect, to go back to the beginning of this presentation, to understand what impact those suppliers and business assets could have. What do you need to know about them? You need to figure out what's the best way to collect that data, whether it's a survey, whether it's a phone call, whether it's some type of cybersecurity monitoring service. And then you also need to think about how you're going to house that data in a way that you can relate the data to other pieces of your business. So if you bring a supplier in and you think there's a chance that there could be some kind of risk that impacts another part of your team, another part of the business you can't see, you need a way to connect all of those dots. And you need a way to share all of that information in real time. So when your exec team needs a report that says, where are we at with this? You can hit a button and it goes to them. Or you need to communicate to your board ahead of their next meeting. Here's what we're seeing. Here's what you need to know about it. So having a way to provide real-time reporting at different stakeholder view levels is like the easiest way to get ahead here. So I'm going to pause here and we'll open it up for questions from the audience. And if you guys want to just add any questions into the Q&A field, and we will go through them. So Jason and Michael, I am going to just do a round robin with a few of these. And Jason, I'll have you start. I'll have you take this one. Okay, so this question is, what are 3 critical risks that we should be focusing on right now?
Okay. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's very tactical, very practical, right? You know, when it comes down to supplier risk management, vendor risk management, what I'll quickly say before I answer the question is that obviously this is sort of a critical subset of a broader enterprise risk management program, lots of different categories of risk. One thing that our clients typically do, or folks that we've talked to typically do, is they can have the general risk that they're tracking, and then maybe in this instance they've got supplier specific instances of those risks. So even within an individual risk itself, they can pinpoint just which suppliers are really moving the needle in the right or the wrong direction on that risk. But to answer your question, the three big ones that immediately popped in and kind of came to mind, number one is just sort of inability for suppliers to deliver key services. Right, that's just that's sort of the initial in a chain reaction of risks, if you think about it. But being able to assess that risk, and obviously there's going to always, with any risk management, there's going to be lots of different inputs that are going to drive that. But is there an inability for a key supplier to deliver on those services? Kind of riding along with that, or sort of the next phase in that daisy chain would be a disruption, the risk of a disruption to critical operations, or the risk of disruption for you to not be able to produce your own goods and services. So if you think about, let's say, an auto manufacturer, they're not going to be able to produce cars if their suppliers who give them the seats can't produce those seats. It's a very simplistic example, but you can see how those are very closely related, and in one kind of almost sort of precedes the other. The other one, and I don't know how many organizations are actually thinking about it in these terms, but is there a risk that of basically an inability to pivot, of not having adequate alternatives in the event that a critical service is identified? Well, what if that vendor, that supplier can't provide that service anymore? Is there an active process or method in place to identify potential alternatives to that? So having a lack of ready alternatives, particularly for strategic suppliers, certainly can be seen as something that would be rather troubling.
Okay. Michael, your turn. I'm going to throw this question your way. How can we establish the right balance between retrieving investment and supporting our suppliers through this crisis? Can you provide specific techniques to manage supplier relationships?
Okay, so first off, thanks for giving Jason the really simple one-part question and me the two-part question. No, I'm just kidding. No, this is really great, and something that is really nice here is part of your question. You're already acknowledging the fact that this is a balancing act. You have to manage your own business's needs along with the needs of those suppliers. And there are steps that you can definitely take to help kind of ease the balance and make this more of a consistent process. And if anything, I would say you can really boil this down to two critical steps, essentially. The first is the categorization of your suppliers. And we kind of talked through, different methods of how to do that within the presentation today. Whether it's financially based, risk-based, findings-based, what that supplier is tied to from kind of like a key organizational aspects. Is that supplier or suppliers, are they related to key processes, maybe objectives that your organization is looking to accomplish? That's going to be your ultimate first step. Because at the end of the day, there are only so many dollars and so many hours. So once you're able to really identify and categorize those, really top tier suppliers, those that either are going to, impact your organization currently or with future objectives, then it comes down to really more of that communication stream that Emily spoke of. And, finding out from those suppliers what's going on, whether it's, hey, how are things going there? How is everyone doing? Is everyone healthy and safe? And then also identifying, what is the risk of you being able to follow through on what has been contracted or not follow through? Is there a middle ground that we can essentially find to where maybe both of us aren't completely whole, but we are at least, moving on where we're able to kind of live to fight another day, or best case scenario, you're able to come to that agreement where, great, we'll advance a couple of payments and we'll get you through this. And at the end of the day, it helps everyone. Whatever the outcome is, it really, comes down to finding those critical suppliers that can greatly impact your organization, and figuring out what level of health they're in right now. Are they hurting? Are they okay? And deploying resources from there.
Thanks, Michael. All right, I'm going to go to the next question here for Jason. Okay, so Jason, as this is a unique situation that we are all experiencing, what level of concern should be given to suppliers that don't necessarily have BCPs, business continuity plans, that address pandemics?
Yeah, I mean, if you would have asked this question maybe 6 months ago, maybe it's like, oh, everyone's working on it. Everyone's kind of, trying to figure this stuff out. I think for me to give an answer other than greatly concerned at this point would probably be a little, just not right. I guess, some of it does come back down to, the nature of the supplier, the nature of the services they provide. An example that I give all the time, and again, I like to keep things overly simplistic sometimes, is if I'm dealing with, the supplier that, manages the security, the operation, the security of my network operations versus the vendor that comes and does the landscaping outside of my building, I'm obviously going to have a little bit more of a chasm between those two in terms of their kind of relative importance to my overall operations. I realize it's an overly simplistic example, but if my landscaper or someone who provides what are deemed non-critical services doesn't necessarily have a pandemic plan in place, and and maybe I'm not even asking that question because of how I've prioritized that supplier, it doesn't really impact me. I think the most important thing to truly answer that question is getting to the root of what, understanding exactly what that supplier does for your organization, understanding how critical it is in the context of your overall operations. And then from there, if you do that appropriately, you're going to hit that decision point to say, well, a disruption, getting back to the first question I answered, their inability to deliver or is going to impact or cause a disruption in our ability to provide critical operations or goods. That's going to be the decision point or sort of the litmus test to say, gosh, I really need to make sure that this particular vendor has a very sound continuity plan for any disruption, certainly for a pandemic. So it's easy for me to say everyone should have one of these plans in place. The reality is probably not everyone's going to have one. And the other reality is it really kind of depends how concerned you should be, really does depend on that relative importance of that supplier in the context of your own business.
So good follow-up question here. Michael, I'll have you respond to this one. What are the key questions we should be asking suppliers to judge their long-term viability?
So, oh man, I mean, we can come at this from a few different angles, but if we think about this from a kind of a foundational, kind of core tenet approach, what truly makes up and drives your business, that can help identify, not only the strength of your organization, but also the strength of those key suppliers. And they should ultimately have, those key suppliers, they need to have continuity and disaster recovery plans in place to not only safeguard their future sustainability, to better manage their cash flow, but also, once again, help you as well. Key questions, I mean, kind of along those core tenets, what BCDR plans do you have in place now? a question as simple as that can very quickly help you understand, are they, maybe they didn't have this specifically for the pandemic until this really struck and started hitting hard earlier this year. But if they've developed something and they are attempting to put it in place, their response is going to quickly help you understand how they're responding to this disruption. Do they even have a plan to respond to this disruption? And does that plan, carry out, for the next few months, or is it a more of a short-term approach? Also being able to identify, working capital. So asking them questions surrounding, please describe your working capital position throughout the life of our contract. So once again, kind of going through, if you're not able to provide the essential services through this, that are kind of stipulated through this contract, what can you provide? And this will help also provide insight into financial viability. So not only have they planned for kind of a continuing pandemic or a continuing hardship, but also are they financially viable, or do they have that financial capacity to really maintain what the BCDR plan has stipulated. Also, just who are your top customers? And all of these questions ultimately give you visibility into primary sources of revenue. So you can evaluate, how those businesses are doing and how they might impact, your supply, your contracts, et cetera. If you're one of the top customers and you're one of the only top customers, then that could, potentially drive some of those approaches that were discussed earlier in terms of early payments or kind of just contract renewal, going through and saying, okay, let's relax some of the delivery times and these other stipulations. But that combination will give you a pretty good range of answers to gauge what their viability is, kind of more for the long haul during times of disruption like this.
Yeah, and Michael, if I can just add to that, so those are all great points. Two things that you said, take it just a slight step further. You're absolutely right about the continuity plans. What are your plans in place to continue in the event of a disruption? And I think, now you're going to see people start to go maybe a level deeper. Instead of just saying, do you have a plan? It's like, okay, also show me proof that you have vetted this plan and you have tested it and you have put it into practice and it's going to work. And then you bring up a great point about kind of the financial viability. Back in my way early days when I studied for and took the CPA, we always talked about the concept of a company being or presenting a going concern. Or if there was a going concern within that vendor, and to ask that question about who are your key customers, how much, and maybe they don't need to name the customers, but what percentage of your overall revenue do your top 5 customers represent? Those are great questions, because that becomes something that highlights a potential going concern issue, a potential situation where you're like, well, gosh, if one or more of these top 3 or top 5 customers falters, that could really put a significant dent in that organization's ability to deliver.
I think the most interesting thing to me is to see how everything will evolve in the next 6 months after we've all been through this experience. We've learned some hard lessons. We've learned some good lessons, but we'll see how this drastically shapes and looks different 6 months from now, a year from now. So I'm always curious to see what people think about what the future will look like in all kinds of different areas. So if everyone listening on the phone on this webinar has some thoughts or some ideas, feel free to reach out and share them with us. I'd love to hear what you guys think and what you have to say. And maybe some advice that you guys are putting in place in your own organizations now, or things that you're looking at putting in place in the future. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. If you do have follow-up questions on anything we discussed, or have ideas that you want to share that you think would be beneficial for anyone else who joined today, please drop us a line. I put our email addresses up there. You can reach out to any of us, all of us. But that's it. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and thanks for joining.
Thank you, everybody.